A joke. You have a choice. I can tell you the one about the fishmonger, or I can tell you the one about Moses and the Torah. No, one will have to be saved for next time. Okay, I'll do the fish one because I love it. Before I tell this joke, it would be useful for those of you who are not aware what a kibitzer is. Does anyone know what a kibitzer is? Thoughts? Someone who jokes. So a kibitzer is someone who thinks that he's better than you, and he loves to give advice that is no good and that you didn't ask for in the first place, right? So I like to call this one the 5 kibitzers. A man by the name of Moshe Rabinowitz was a fish peddler, and he decided he would improve his business. He sold his pushcart and he rented a store. He thought, why not do a little advertising? So he painted a sign to hang over the doorway. The sign said, "Fresh fish sold here daily." He had just climbed a ladder to hang his sign when a kibitzer passed by. "What kind of cockamamie sign is that?" yelled the kibitzer. "Why? What's wrong with it?" answered the fishmonger. "Why say fresh fish? Would you sell fish that wasn't fresh? Your customers might get suspicious." "You are absolutely right," said the fishmonger. So he painted out the word fresh and continued hanging his sign. A second kibitzer came by and yelled up to Rabinowitz, "Wait, I like your sign, but should you be saying sold? Of course you sell fish. You don't give them away for free, do you?" "Of course," agreed Rabinowitz, and so he painted out the word sold. A third kibitzer came by, complimented him on his sign, and yelled up, "Why do you say here? Are you selling fish somewhere else?" "You are right," said Rabinowitz, and he painted out here. As soon as he had corrected the sign, a fourth kibitzer walked up and yelled, "Hey, your sign is a little bit confusing. What do you mean by daily? If fish are fresh, they don't come in and go out weekly, do they?" "I am in complete agreement," said Rabinowitz. He painted out the word daily. Now the sign simply said fish. He came down the ladder and was looking up at the sign when a fifth kibitzer walked by. "Pardon me, Rabinowitz, I don't mean to butt in, but why are you putting up a useless sign that says fish when you can smell your fish a mile away?" So Rabinowitz, the fish peddler, took down his sign. How fortunate he was, he thought, to have such good advice from all his friends. But that's not the end of the story. Sometime later, Rabinowitz was sitting in a chair in front of his store when another kibitzer came by. "Rabinowitz, it looks like you don't have many customers," he said. "Well, business is a little slow," he admitted. "So why don't you hang up a sign?" the kibitzer advised. Friendly advice from people, right? Today's Torah portion is Mishpatim, judgments. What an amazing portion this is, too. Following the revelation that God reveals himself and communicates eternal truths at Mount Sinai, our Torah portion, Mishpatim, expands on the details of some of the mitzvot, the commandments. We find instruction on civil laws that were to govern the children of Israel. There are laws pertaining to servants and their release, laws on personal injuries and property, laws on social responsibility, laws on justice and compassion, laws relating to Shabbat and kosher, and laws on the feasts of Adonai. The Parsha ends with Moshe ascending the mountain for 40 days. There's so much to be gleaned, I think, from this portion. I'd like to share a few things that came to my mind as I was studying and praying this week about this. One of the most famous phrases in all of the Torah makes its appearance in this week's Torah portion. I'd like to sort of grant this phrase my theme for today, if you will. The phrase consists of two small yet significant Hebrew words, na'aseh v'nishma, and it quite literally means we will do and we will hear. What's so special about that? There are a number of interpretations that have emerged across the span of centuries regarding this phrase. One of them which I mention simply because it's the predominant interpretation today among Jewish circles, but one of them appears in the Babylonian Talmud, where it's taken to describe the enthusiasm and wholeheartedness with which the Israelites accepted the covenant with the Holy One at Mount Sinai. According to this interpretation, when the people said to Moshe, "All that Adonai has spoken, we will do and we will hear," they were saying, in essence, whatsoever God asks of us, we will do. The interesting thing about this interpretation is that it stresses that the people were saying this before they had heard any of the commandments that would be given. In other words, they were so keen to signal their agreement with what God was giving and telling them that they agreed to his instructions before they even knew what they were. This is, as I said, the most predominant interpretation in Jewish circles today. And it's interesting and not without merit, but there are some difficulties with this interpretation as well. For one thing, it's problematic because it depends on reading the narrative out of chronological sequence, reading it in a non-linear pattern. For them, the words na'aseh v'nishma mean we will do and we will hear. Not simply we will do and we will hear, but we will do and we will obey. I can hear some of you thinking to yourself something that I've said before. The root of the word nishma is shema, which, as we know, means so much more than simply to hear or to listen. It can mean understanding, absorbing, internalizing, responding, and most importantly, obeying. And you would be right. So there's something to this popular interpretation. Do I put too fine a point on it? Probably, but that's what I do. I like to nitpick tiny things and dig and dig and dig. Another interpretation, which is not in the plainest sense of the text, but it's important nonetheless, has been given often through the lens of modern thinking. In this contemporary view, na'aseh v'nishma means we will do and we will understand. From this, we are to derive that we can understand our faith by doing it, performing the commands and living a life of holiness. In the beginning is the deed itself. Only after comes the insight as well as the comprehension of the deed that was commanded. This is similar to the first interpretation, but it goes one step further. It suggests, unlike the first, that understanding can and will be experienced in time. And I think this is an important point. The modern Western mind tends to put things in the opposite order. We seek to understand what we are committing ourselves to before making the commitment. Now, that is all fine and well when what is at stake is signing a contract. When you sit down with your banker to sign for a home loan, for example, you probably take the time to read through the documents and understand the obligation under which you will be placed. You don't simply pick up the pen and sign away your life. When you buy the latest smartphone, you probably ask a lot of questions about the contract. Neither of these is an example of an existential commitment, such as the one given to the children of Israel in this week's Parsha. In other words, the only way to understand leadership is to lead. The only way to understand marriage is to get married. The only way to understand whether a certain career path is the right one for you is to try it for a period of time. Let me say this. Those who hover on the edge of commitment, reluctant to make a decision until all the facts and variables are in and dissected and pondered, will eventually find that life has passed them by. The only way to comprehend life is to be willing to take the risk of living it. Earl Nightingale once said, "Most people tiptoe their way through life, hoping they make it safely to death." As a disciple of the Master, we are to be in community and engaged in doing rather than simply hearing. We find this idea echoed beautifully in the words of the brother of Messiah when it says in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, "What use is it if someone says he has faith but he has no works? If a brother or sister is without clothing and is in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. He's not speaking here of works as a means to salvation, as some have interpreted it. Rather, he speaks of a living and vibrant faith that is manifest by living and walking a life of sanctification. We are saved in the finished work of Messiah Yeshua, but then our faith is made alive by the works of righteousness that are done through that faith. There is no single normative approach to this type of work spirituality and walking in holiness. The whole of the Word of God speaks in a multiplicity of voices. Isaiah was not Ezekiel. The book of Proverbs comes from a different mindset than the books of Amos and Hosea. Matthew had a very different approach to divine things than did John. The Bible contains law and narrative, history and vision, ritual and prayer. There are norms about how to act as followers of the risen Messiah, but there are fewer about how to think and feel and respond to the Almighty. We experience the Holy One in different ways. Some find God in nature, in what Wordsworth called, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean, and the living air and the blue sky and the mind of man. Others find him in interpersonal emotion, in the experience of loving and serving their neighbor, of loving and being loved. Some find God in the prophetic call found in Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Others, like myself, find him in study, rejoicing in my words, for they are our life and the length of our days. On them we will meditate day and night. Yet others find him in prayer and contemplation, discovering that he is close to all who call upon his name in faith. There are those who find God in joy, dancing and singing as did King David when he brought the Holy Ark into Jerusalem or went into battle. Others find him in the depths, in tears and remorse, in staggering grief, in a fractured heart. Most of us have found him during times such as these, when he meets us in the broken and gently puts his hand on our heart. Anne Voskamp has said, our broken hearts always break his. It is the quantum physics of God. Your one broken heart always splits God's heart in two. You never cry alone. Similarly, Elizabeth Elliot said, we want to avoid suffering, death, sin, ashes, but we live in a world crushed and broken and torn, a world God himself visited to redeem. We receive his poured out life, and being allowed the high privilege of suffering with him, may then pour ourselves out for others. Einstein found God in the fearful symmetry and ordered complexity of the universe. Some find him in the loneliness of being as it reaches out of the very delicate soul of being itself. Thomas Merton said, the turning of our whole self to God can be achieved only by deep and sincere and simple faith, enlivened by a hope which knows that contact with God is possible, and love which desires above all things to do his will. Let me ask you a question that I get asked probably more as a rabbi than any other question. How do we know when we hear God's voice? How do we separate that voice from our own internal dialogue or from the promptings of others? We live in a world with many voices seeking our attention. I say this with earnestness, and I say it often because I believe the voices of the world are getting louder, threatening to take us away incrementally from the Creator. With all the breaking news alerts and blogs, podcasts, social media, the compelling advice from Alexa, Siri, Google, others, we may find that it is difficult to know which voices to trust. Sometimes we crowdsource guidance in our lives. You ever done that? Thinking that the majority will provide the best sources of truth. In fact, advertisers count on this mentality. Pay attention to advertisements on television or the radio or the internet, and you'll often hear things such as the number one doctor's choice, or that more people trust such and such a product than any other. One of my favorite, if you know me, you know how much I love Oreos. Oreo's current motto, milk's favorite cookie. Have they interviewed milk? Does the same hold true for soy milk or others, maybe? I don't know. How many of you recall the tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, Germany? Remember that, maybe from childhood? Have any of you been to that beautiful city? The Pied Piper is the story of a man who entered, long ago, the village of Hamelin and offered for a specified sum of money to rid the town of the vermin with which it was plagued. When the contract was agreed upon, he played his pipe, and the rats soon came swarming from the buildings to follow him to the river, where they drowned. When the town leaders then refused to pay him for his services, he returned to play his pipe, and he led the precious children away from the safety of their families and their homes, never to return. We must ask ourselves, are there Pied Pipers even today? Are they playing alluring music to lead to their own destruction those who will listen and follow? These pipers weave the tunes of pride and covetousness, of selfishness, of complacency, and leave in their wake confused minds and troubled hearts, empty lives and shattered dreams. One who spoke to Philip of old expressed the plea of deep yearning of countless numbers when he said in Acts 8:31, how can I understand except some man should guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. On other occasions, we hesitate between two or more choices or opinions. We waver between cold and hot, and we often choose lukewarm. I think the Master was pretty clear on how he feels about that. Revelation 3:16. So because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew you out of my mouth. Still, other times we follow what is convenient, focus on a single voice or issue to guide us, or rely exclusively upon our own ability to think and reason. There is a danger in this. Proverbs 3, starting in verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. While seeking the help and advice of friends can be helpful, and is often helpful in its own way and in the correct season, experience teaches that the guidance given, though well-intentioned, isn't always reliable. What is popular is not always what is best. Halting between two opinions brings no real direction. Convenience rarely leads to things that matter. Fixation on a single voice or issue can impair our ability to see with exactness and clarity. Paul spoke of this when he said in 1 Corinthians 13, beginning in verse 11, when I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. How many of us have truly put away childish things in spiritual matters? Relying solely upon our own understanding can lead us into a hyper-intellectual stupor of thought. If we're not careful, the wrong voices can draw us away from the truth of the gospel and lead us to places where faith is difficult to sustain. There we find ourselves with little more than staggering emptiness, bitterness, and dissatisfaction. We become overwhelmed with life and what we come to perceive as broken promises. Let me use an example of what I mean through an analogy. Many of you know my fascination with mountain climbing. I'm not referring to those gentle hills that we find ourselves climbing on a beautiful summer day when they happen in Alaska. My fascination is with those who pursue the giant peaks of the world, Everest, K2, Annapurna, this sort of thing. I remember growing up, I had told my father, I will climb Everest someday. And he says, you know, it's super dangerous. And I said, but it's gotten better. It used to be 1 out of 4 who attempted to summit Everest died. Now it's only 1 out of 5. So progress again. John Krakauer, I know some of you have read his book, Into Thin Air, said this about Everest. Everest has always been a magnet for kooks, publicity seekers, hopeless romantics, and others with a shaky hold on reality. The crazy climbers, as they are often called. Mountain climbers that fit into this category commonly refer to altitudes above 26,247 feet as the death zone. They do so because at those heights there is not enough oxygen to sustain life. When you are climbing in the death zone, you are quite literally dying. There's a spiritual equivalent to the death zone. If we spend too much time in faithless places, seemingly well-intended voices that we allow to speak into our lives can deprive us of the spiritual oxygen that we so desperately need. The slopes of Everest are littered with the corpses of those who relied on their own understanding of how the mountain would treat them. Because the Holy One wants better for us, he makes it possible for us to hear his voice. Most often we hear him through the impressions given to us through the Holy Spirit. The Spirit speaks to different people in different ways, and even in different ways at different times. As a result, learning the many ways the Spirit speaks to us becomes a lifelong quest. We see an example of this in 1 Kings 19. And so he said, "Go forth and stand upon the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, kol demana daka, a still, small voice." Oswald Chambers wrote, "God seldom speaks to us in startling ways, but sometimes he speaks in ways that are easy to misunderstand, and we say, 'I wonder if that is God's voice.' Isaiah said that the Lord spake to him with a strong hand, that is, by the pressure of circumstances. Nothing touches our lives, but it is God himself speaking. Do we discern his hand or only merely occurrence? Get into the habit of saying, 'Speak, Lord,' and life will become a romance. Every time circumstances press, say, 'Speak, Lord,' and then make time to listen. As we listen, our ear gets acute, and like Messiah, we shall hear God all the time." The Almighty spoke to the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness. But why? I often speak about how God meets his people in the wilderness. This can be both literal as well as metaphorical. The desert is a place of silence. There is very little visually to distract you, and there is not a lot of ambient noise to muffle sound. To be sure, when the children of Israel received the Torah, there was thunder and lightning and the sound of the shofar. The earth felt as if it were shaking at its very foundations. But in a later age, when the prophet Elijah stood at that same mountain after his confrontation with the prophets of Baal, he encountered the Holy One not in wind or fire or earthquake, but in that still small voice. During Shavuot, during Pentecost, we read in Acts 2, "When the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And tongues like fire spreading out appeared to them and settled on each one of them. They were then all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them to speak out." We will hear the voice of the Almighty in many different places. We will then find that when we pray, when we read his word, when we are on his own in his creation, when we listen to music of praise or we dance, when we're in community here, when we engage in faithful discussions or meet and study the word in homes or with our family. Seeking his voice in any one of these places is good, but seeking it in many of them is even better. When we hear him, it is to our benefit and blessing to heed his voice. Again, James said, "Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only." And so in this life, we watch, we wait, we listen for that still small voice, and when it speaks, we strive to obey. We follow, even if we do not always understand the whys, as the children of Israel did not understand the whys at the base of Mount Sinai. He knows you. He knows each of you, and He desires more than your praise and your adoration. He desires a deep and abiding relationship with you. He desires for you to draw close to Him. I can make you a promise. Until you are able to forge that eternal bond of relationship with your Creator, no other relationship in this life will bring substantial meaning. He must be first. We must return to our first love. We can seek and find the Almighty at the heights and in the depths, in loneliness and in belonging, in love and in fear, in gratitude and in need, in dazzling light and in the midst of deep and despairing darkness. We can find God by seeking Him, but sometimes He finds us when we least expect it. That is the difference between Naaseh and Venishma. We do the godly deeds together. We respond to His commands with one voice, but we hear and feel God's presence in many diverse ways. For though He is one, we are all unique, and we encounter Him each in our own way. And that's all I have to say about that. Let me tell you the second joke now that she made me feel guilty. Okay, so when God gave the Torah to Moses, He was commanded to go out and seek peoples who would be willing to accept it. And He visited peoples and cultures from all over the world. This is obviously the joke, right? And at a time, He went to the Germans, and He said, "Here, I have this beautiful gift from God." And they looked it over, and they said, "Oh, it says we have to not meet on the Sabbath, but we like to go hiking and do all these things, and no, we'll pass, no good." Finally, He went to the French, and the French read it over, and they said, "Oh, no, it says we have to not drink to excess, but we love our wine. We cannot have this Torah of yours." And at long last, and finally, He went to the Jewish people, and He said, "I have this beautiful gift from God, and I'm hoping that you'll accept it." And they read it through, and they said, "How much does it cost?" And Moses said, "Well, it's free. It's a free gift from God." And they said, "We'll take two."